Welcome to the Hills Getting a Diagnosis ASAP Progress in Early Alzheimer's Detection event. Please welcome Bill Salmon, SVP of Editorial Content at The Hill.
Thank you so much. Welcome on this peak bloom day, I'm told. Today is the peak bloom day of our cherry blossoms. And it's supposed to be 80 degrees today. So if you get a chance to head down to the tidal basin, actually, you don't really need to go to the tidal basin because there's a bunch of cherry blossoms right around here. My name is Bill Salmon. I do work at The Hill, and I'm so delighted that you've come here for this very important program. We're calling it Getting a Diagnosis ASAP, Progress in Early Alzheimer's Detection. And I don't have to tell the people in this room that more than 7 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease. And until recently, patients couldn't really get an Alzheimer diagnosis without some sort of an invasive procedure or an expensive scan. Fortunately, we now have something called BBB tests, which are blood-based biomarker tests. And essentially, that allows a doctor to simply use a routine blood sample in order to diagnose Alzheimer's. And recently, the FDA cleared 2 of these BBB tests for use in diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. Unsurprisingly, over 90% of Americans would prefer this type of unobtrusive routine medical test over the alternatives when given the choice, according to a recent survey. So, Capitol Hill has heard these cries. The lawmakers have introduced bipartisan legislation. It's called the ASAP Act. ASAP Act. And it would not only improve early detection of Alzheimer's, but it would also allow Medicare to cover the costs of these BBB tests, because currently federal law prohibits Medicare from covering the costs of these tests. In other words, a lot of patients still don't have affordable access to this sort of screening. So, obviously, passage of the ASAP Act would be a significant step forward in terms of treatment of Alzheimer's care. Obviously, a lot to discuss today. Again, I want to thank everybody, not just in the room, but those of you who are joining us online. If you're following along the conversation on social media, and I hope you are, you can use the hashtag #TheHillHealth. That's hashtag #TheHillHealth. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the Alliance for Aging Research, for their support in making today's program possible. In fact, we are going to begin the program with what we call our sponsor perspective. So what we will be watching is Sue Peshin, who is the president and CEO of the Alliance for Aging Research, speaking with Jay Reinstein, a patient who has early onset Alzheimer's. Let's take a look.
In many ways, the outlook for Alzheimer's and related diseases has never been more promising. In the last 5 years, the FDA has approved 3 early Alzheimer's disease-modifying medications that delay cognitive and functional decline, and 2 symptomatic therapies. Last year, the FDA cleared 2 blood tests for people ages 55 and older who show signs or symptoms of cognitive impairment. One can be used in primary care to rule out Alzheimer's disease in those who test negative, and direct those with a positive result to further testing for diagnosis and appropriate treatment. And another is used to help diagnose Alzheimer's disease in specialty settings, which will reduce the need for more invasive and expensive tests such as spinal taps and PET scans. As researchers aim at asymptomatic disease, they're simultaneously testing the reliability of blood tests for Alzheimer's screening. So imagine a world where we could screen for Alzheimer's with simple blood tests, like we do today for heart disease, diabetes, and many cancers, years or even decades before signs or symptoms. That world is on its way, but we need to prepare, and we need policymakers to help ensure coverage and fair access. We're grateful to have Jay Reinstein with us today. Jay is a person living with Alzheimer's disease who has advocated at the highest levels of government to improve access to care for future generations. We're also fortunate that Jay serves on the Alliance for Aging Research's board of directors. Jay, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. So I have to share a little bit about my journey into this disease of Alzheimer's, and it really began on the job. I was an assistant city manager in Fayetteville, North Carolina, a very busy place to work, and I started having issues with processing information, especially during some of these intense city council meetings. A lot of things were going back and forth, and I wasn't picking it up. I was working later hours on the job. And then I found myself really deferring to staff, especially during city council meetings, because I really wasn't thinking too swiftly on my feet. And I remember I sort of went into this panic mode. It was probably 8 or 9 months after all of these issues were going on. Initially, I attributed it really to just information overload. And I remember having to call a friend of mine who was a neurologist at Duke. And I asked him, is there any way I can get some testing done? I don't know what kind of testing, but they did what they call a neuropsych. And I remember going in, did the neuropsych. I ended up coming back about 8 or 9 months later. And at that time, they did another neuropsych and an MRI. I remember my wife and I going into the office, and it was at that time, it was probably about 10 or 12 months after the initial issues where I was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And honestly, I thought it was all the time. I just had a lot on my plate. My wife said she noticed some stuff going on. Well, probably 6, 7 months after the diagnosis, I'm still working. And actually, I worked about another 6 months. And I started doing some things that were probably not the most intelligent things to do. I ended up going to a car dealership just on a whim. I go and buy a BMW, more than I can afford, not the most intelligent thing to do. I get home and my wife is like, what are you doing? And it just was very poor judgment and impulsivity. And since then, I've had a lot of changes. I mean, now I don't drive. They took my license away from me after about a year and a half after my diagnosis. Still have issues with short-term memory, processing information. But I think the key that has really helped me is being socially active. I mean, I stay very active. I'm participating in this study at Georgetown where they look at my brain. They do the PET tau scans and the amyloid scans. I do that annually. And then a real big important part of my life is advocating. And I have a great opportunity to serve on the board for the Alliance for Aging Research. I just got off the board several years ago, National Board of Directors for Alzheimer's. And a big part of my life is really working with our state and federal governments on trying to identify new Alzheimer's research options and just new legislative items, specifically including this new ASAP Act.
Yeah. Yeah. And we both serve on the board of Voices of Alzheimer's, which is a pleasure. So you mentioned the ASAP Act, and that stands for the Alzheimer's Screening and Prevention Act. It's a bipartisan bill in Congress, and it would create a pathway for Medicare coverage of FDA-approved and cleared blood biomarker screening tests. So tell us a little bit about why access to Alzheimer's screening and early detection is so important.
Well, I mean, on a personal level, that early detection is so critical because it really gives you an opportunity to make those lifestyle changes. Trying to reduce stress, eating better, staying away from the donuts and ice cream. And research shows that as many as half of the cases, like mine, are undetected in primary care. And it took, for me, approximately 15 months for my diagnosis. And like I said earlier, I probably had signs maybe a year earlier that I attributed just to a lot of work, but it was probably some of those signs for early onset Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, under the current law, it could take more than a decade. That's 10 years before Medicare has the authority to cover FDA-approved blood-based biomarker screenings for Alzheimer's. And that's why we are very excited about the Alzheimer's Screening and Prevention Act that Sue just mentioned. It's known as the ASAP Act for short, and the bill would really create a pathway for Medicare to cover routine blood-based dementia screening tests. and future test methods approved by the FDA. And again, this bill was recently introduced by Representatives Vern Buchanan of Florida and Paul Tonko of New York, who will be on the program later today.
Right.
And the bill is like the Medicare Multi-Cancer Early Detection Screening Coverage Act, that's a mouthful, that passed Congress as part of the appropriations package in late January. And the Alliance for Aging Research was very appreciative to support the cancer community in getting this bill passed. And we're very excited to advocate for the ASAP bill.
Yeah. That's great. Well, so it definitely sounds like early detection and diagnosis allows people to plan from based on your experience. It took a while. You lost that time, maybe enrolling clinical trials, and then, look and access treatments. So in thinking about time, what does more time mean to you on a personal level?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, Sue, more time is more time with my wife and my kids and my grandkids, my friends, my parents
Yeah.
who are aging. I mean, that's really a priority. And I think if I was able to take this blood test earlier in my life, there's no question that I would have made major adjustments. As I said earlier, diet and exercise is huge, and maybe not taking or maybe thinking about a less stressful type job. There are great opportunities that can make a difference in people's lives. And unfortunately, I wanted so badly to be in a clinical trial with some of these new drugs. Unfortunately, I have 3 autoimmune disorders. I couldn't qualify. And again, while it was very stressful not being able to get in, a clinical trial would have given me hope.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, in your advocacy, you've been very vocal about how this could improve Alzheimer's detection and care in rural communities and in other types of underserved communities. So, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So blood tests are less expensive. And again, compared to like the PET scans, and their future use and screening will ideally be able to be used in primary care settings. And quite honestly, it is so difficult to find a neurologist in rural settings, especially, but even in the larger cities, it can take 12 to 18 months. And that to me is, really unacceptable. And even where I live in the Raleigh-Durham area, it's not easy to find a neurologist. It's a similar issue to other diagnostic tests. You need specialists for those PET scans and spinal taps as well, Sue.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so we have been vocal together through the Alliance about how coverage and access for Alzheimer's care tends to be more restricted than for other diseases. What have you seen, and what are you working to change?
Well, we're talking about screening and early diagnosis today, but none of this really will help people if there isn't fair access to FDA-approved treatments. Medicare and private payers are increasingly putting financial risk ahead of health risk. Until recently, the costs for Alzheimer's care have primarily fallen on families because most care has not been in medical in nature. Now that we have more FDA-approved treatments, there has been an active resistance against fair coverage and access by payers. And it was just really a few years ago, I remember this, that Medicare blamed Part B premium increases on some of the new Alzheimer's treatments right after restricting access to them. We hope this administration will really change its overly restrictive Medicare coverage policies soon for all of these medications.
Yeah, what very well said. Very well said. Final thoughts for Congress, or since you talked about Medicare, the folks who are currently serving in the Medicare program?
Yeah, actually, for Congress, we asked that you pass the ASAP Act. This legislation, as most Alzheimer's legislation is, it's bipartisan and it's a win-win. Our community needs you to know you are on our side. And again, we got to give special thanks to Congressman Buchanan and Congressman Tonko for co-sponsoring this ASAP bill and for their tireless support and efforts. And if more people my age could get diagnosed before the disease becomes disruptive, it really would allow families to plan and improve their peace of mind. To the people of Medicare, I'm speaking to you directly. Please expand access to the currently available FDA-approved therapies that can slow the progression of Alzheimer's. People living with Alzheimer's, like me, are just like everyone else. And people who have been paying into the Medicare program their entire lives and look for it to be there when we need it. The science of these tests and treatments has made the outlook for this terrible disease a little bit brighter, but we really need them to be more accessible to make a difference for patients and families.
Yeah. Jay, thank you so much for spending time with us today and for everything that you do.
Thank you.
Now please welcome to the stage Kathleen Koch, a contributing editor at The Hill.
Good morning, everyone. And wasn't that a poignant story? I think it's probably familiar to a lot of us. I know my mother-in-law passed away from Alzheimer's. Anyone else have family members with the disease? Yeah. Well, I'm going to welcome someone to the stage to do a deeper dive into what's going on around the policies regarding these Alzheimer's therapies and tests. So please welcome to the stage Joe Grogan. He's a non-resident senior scholar at the USC Schaefer Institute, former director of the Domestic Policy Council, and former assistant to President Trump. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Joe, your years in the Trump administration, when you were head of the Domestic Policy Council, you also headed up domestic health spending at the Office of Management and Budget. I imagine that gave you a real insight, a real understanding for the drug approval and access process, and also the way federal law can either help or hinder that, or federal processes. So what is your take on the current debate right now on allowing Medicare to cover these blood-based biomarker tests for Alzheimer's?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. And Sue, that was a great conversation. I can't think of a better way to start this discussion. I'd say, my experience goes back even further than just the first Trump administration. In the Bush administration, I headed up the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS. And I don't think this current debate is any different than we had at the dawn of the HIV epidemic, when there was a lot of pressure put on the government not to push screening for HIV because there weren't, at the time, quote, effective treatments for HIV. So there was a huge push at the beginning of the HIV epidemic that screening and testing for HIV was a waste of time.
So you're saying the same thing is happening with Alzheimer's because there's not a cure? I mean, there are treatments.
Sure, there's great treatments. I think there's two things going on. And I'll say this, same thing happened with hepatitis C as well. I was at Gilead Sciences when we launched a very effective cure for hepatitis C. There was a ton of pressure on the part of payers that disparaged the treatments and said these treatments aren't any good. Before there were really effective treatments, there was a lot of pressure not to screen, even though lifestyle changes could affect disease progression. And I think the same thing is happening now. There is a real need for people to screen and gain the knowledge to make the lifestyle changes that they can make, number one, and then figure out whether or not the treatments that have been approved by FDA, donanemab and lecanemab, are right for them. They're not right for everybody, but they show real promise. And unfortunately, I think there's pressure on the part of payers to disparage the FDA approval process, as there was with the HIV treatments when protease inhibitors were first approved, and payers said these things don't work, it's a waste of time. Same thing with the hepatitis C medications when they were first approved. And I remember in the hepatitis C debate saying, do you think we have a problem paying for these? Wait till we get treatments and cures for Alzheimer's, because we have over 7 million people.
So you saw this coming.
Absolutely. And we saw it in the Biden administration when they said they put massive, as the gentleman referred to, huge restrictions on access to these drugs, and then blamed premium increases that didn't, there were no justification because it was very little access, premium increases on the Alzheimer's drug approvals, and we're seeing it again.
Let me ask, so the treatments, though, that currently exist are only effective in the very early stages of Alzheimer's, correct? So it would seem to me that would make a greater case for approving these early diagnostic tests.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The science is evolving to show exactly that point that you're making. And we're having this debate right now around pre-symptomatic or stage 1, stage 0 even Alzheimer's, because you can start to have the physical manifestations within your brain before your family notices or you notice that you are declining. So the treatments, and we're starting to see, are demonstrating promise for early treatment to affect disease progression. But even separating the drugs for a second, and there's a ton of new drugs that are in development right now, you can make lifestyle changes, cutting alcohol down, more exercise, changing your diet to push your time out before you need more medical care, perhaps even going into a dementia home, spend more time with your family. And that can save taxpayers, millions of dollars if we can keep people healthier longer. I was just out at the University of Southern California. Their estimates now are about $780 billion that we're spending on Alzheimer's. And that number is going to go up well over a trillion and a half, maybe 1.7 trillion over the next 20, 30 years. So if we can delay disease progression and keep people in their homes with their families longer, we can not just save taxpayers money, but keep families together longer.
So help us understand this delay that occurs. So the FDA approves a drug, a treatment for Alzheimer's, but then there is this delay time before CMS says we will cover that. Why does that occur? And I mean, I understand you did an op-ed in 2024 arguing for I guess donanemab, one of the treatments, because it had been approved by the FDA and CMS is like, nope, we're not ready to cover it.
Yeah, this has been it's an ongoing frustration of mine. And I worked a couple years at the FDA as well, and it's a fantastic place to work and just amazing people working there.
And amazing people work at CMS. My husband used to work there. So
that is true
have to
too.
put that plug in there.
That is true too. But there always is this push to second guess FDA approvals for any number of reasons. And again, a lot of times the payer community will second guess the scientific rigor with which FDA approved. And there are accusations of corruption, there are accusations of shenanigans, incomplete data files, that is often unjustified. There are mistakes made, I'm not saying there aren't. These drugs need to be continuously monitored.
And this is to justify them not covering them right away?
Absolutely. And CMS does have a different mandate. And I'm a budget hawk, having been at the Office of Management and Budget. But they do have a different mandate to not pay for unnecessary treatments. But sometimes that leads to them second guessing FDA's rigor and scientific judgments. And I think that's happened with some of these, with the treatments. But with the screening tests, it is a mess. The diagnostics frequently take a lot longer. Devices take a lot longer for coverage at CMS.
Why is that?
Well, it's a long, the staff is they don't have enough staff there, number one. They have a different governing statute. It can take years and years to cover these. FDA approved these tests for diagnosis, so they can be paid for by Medicare after your physician says, we think you have Alzheimer's, you're demonstrating these outward symptoms, so they can order the tests and Medicare can pay for them. What they can't pay for, though, is the screening, using the blood-based test for screening. So before these tests came on the market, you needed a spinal tap or a PET scan. But we're at the stage that these tests are so moderately invasive, just a blood biomarker, that they should be part of routine Medicare screening, annual screening. And then because when you're talking about 8 million people that have this disease, you're talking about a lot of Medicare beneficiaries and a lot of people aging into Medicare that would benefit from having the knowledge that, hey, you are on track. If you make the lifestyle changes right now, you can improve your disease progression, and we can monitor you so that when you are eligible for the drugs that are approved now or the next wave of drugs, we can get you on appropriate treatment.
So if the test is covered, if it is used as a diagnostic, when you already have symptoms and you've seen your doctor about it, but if you're one of those people who say it runs in your family, like, I'm just curious if I might get it someday, then it falls into the prevention category, and that's not covered.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. The CMS only in very rare circumstances, including as referenced, colorectal screening because Congress stepped in, they don't pay for prevention, which is counterintuitive, right? Because you want seniors to be as healthy as long as possible and be as active as possible, productive at work, with their families longer. So that's why the ASAP Act is so important, to keep these families together, keep people working for as long as possible. And frankly, I think it's a cost saver. This is penny wise, pound foolish to not pay for these screening tests.
So is the ASAP Act really then the best way to get these covered? It's going to take an act of Congress?
I think it is going to take an act of Congress. I think that, the CMS, if they just go through the normal process, it will take years and years that we frankly don't have. The ASAP Act is one of the most necessary pieces of legislation that I've seen. I saw Congressman Buchanan comes in, and I was sorry to see that he's retiring, but I hope that he can get this done this year before he's leaving, along with Congressman Tonko, because it is the best route we have to getting screening for Alzheimer's.
Now, I'm curious, there's something called CED, and that's coverage with evidence development. Now, I understand that allows CMS to cover a new or groundbreaking drug or procedure while, additional evidence is collected to answer questions or uncertainties. Why would that not work in this case?
Well, CED was originally developed in the Bush administration in order to do exactly that. Unfortunately, in order to speed new treatments, mostly screening tests and devices into coverage while the evidence base is built in the real world. Unfortunately, CMS has used it to restrict access. And I was an early supporter of CED. I've become pretty much a hardcore opponent of it, because it is really, some of these CED restrictions are in place for years and years. There's some that go on longer than a decade.
So what does it do? Then drugs or treatments end up in tests in limbo?
Yeah, they ultimately end up in this sort of hyper-restricted zone of CMS coverage. And CMS doesn't have enough staff to review whether or not the data has manifested itself to repeal it. They don't make a big effort to repeal it and get wider access, and they are worried about the cost implications if they do. So it's not just confined to this screening test. I've been opposed to CED for years. Currently, one of the Alzheimer's treatment, all the amyloid plaque inhibitors are subject to coverage with the evidence development right now, and it's very restrictive.
Well, Joe Grogan, thank you so much for coming and taking the time to help bring some clarity to this very complex issue. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now, please welcome to the stage two congressmen who are co-sponsors of this act that we've been talking so much about, the ASAP Act. Congressman Vern Buchanan is Vice Chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and Congressman Paul Tonko, Democrat from New York, also co-sponsor of the act. Gentlemen, join me here. Thank you. So you are, as I said, both co-sponsors of the ASAP Act. So could you give us a little bit more detail and what exactly it would do, the specifics of the act.
You want to go?
Sure. In October of 25, the FDA approved what is one of the first blood-based biomarkers that determines whether or not there's a concern for Alzheimer's. And if the amyloid count is indicated through that blood test, then they would be eligible with our bill for Medicare coverage, which I think is very important. We've been working with Vern. He's terrific to work with. We have a bipartisan bill that we're hoping to get through as the ASAP bill, the Alzheimer's Screening and Prevention Act. And basically, where legislation has advanced coverage for Medicare, it's in situations like cancer and diabetes, and I think Parkinson's too is covered. But there are certain diseases, but you have to add this to the list. And so our effort is to make certain that because it's less invasive and because there's hope here to have earlier detection, to roll with the ASAP bill.
Any restrictions on it?
Let me just say, to me, my whole focus on the health side, I'm not a doctor or anything, but I'm big on prevention. I think our whole healthcare system is backwards. We react to things instead of being proactive. My dad, unfortunately, had Alzheimer's. I lived through that for 10 or 12 years.
He was diagnosed very young.
He was, 58, very young. And, it was very difficult time for our family. But initially, we moved him into a nursing home and thought that would be an ass. Then what happened is, after a period of a year, I was doing well in business. So I said, no, so I'm not leaving my dad there. I thought I'd maybe be there a year or two. He ended up 10 or 12 years with a nurse in our facility. So that's why I'm so passionate about health in general. My mother had some issues too, on a different note. But the point is to get after these things in the early stages the best we can. And that's why we're fighting for this. There's a lot of momentum in the Democratic and Republican side of things. And I think we've got 50 co-sponsors, and it's probably 50-50. So the idea is, how do we deal with diseases like Alzheimer's, but get it early? And anything we can do on that front makes a big difference. And I think a lot of it can be, if you look at heart disease, cancer, they tell me on cancer, you catch it early. Many times you can deal with it in a positive way long term. And I think that's the same thing what we're trying to do here. We will find a way to get the money, the funds, one way or the other, because it's too expensive not to. And so I'm very bullish about that.
Congressman Tonko, I know that you recently championed, the reauthorization of the National Alzheimer's Project Act through 2035, and that basically creates a national plan, a national sort of blueprint to follow for tackling Alzheimer's. How important has that 2011 law been in the recent breakthroughs that we've seen?
When I first came to Congress, there was an effort to establish with the Project Act, the Alzheimer's Project Act, a 2025 target for bringing together all the related federal agencies, clinicians, patients, families, bringing them together to a common table and really giving high focus and priority to the conquering of Alzheimer's, simply because of the numbers. With millions of people, now we're at 7 to 8 million. It's a huge impact on the budget, but it's about the dignity factor and the quality of life. That project moved along. They appointed a board. It was, I think, major strides forward. It's great success stories with even the pharmaceutical industry. But we were approaching that 2025 target, and we needed to, we thought, to extend that to 2035. So that was part of legislation that I advanced to make certain that this project situation continues in a very, meaningful way, in a very academic way. In fact, it was such a success that we had done the same thing for the Parkinson's program with a Parkinson's national plan. So these two most neurologically impacting diseases require that focus from Washington. And I think this is just another building block that came from it. The ASAP bill is another kind of effort to move forward with a great deal of progress.
Congressman Buchanan, you were talking about early detection and how important that is for patients, but how important is that really also for caregivers, for families?
Well, we went through that. It's for many families. We were fortunate because I was in a financial position to do something. But many families, it's a major, major struggle. And I feel bad because it's not just my father, but a lot of other people that are good friends over the years. They've had parents, brothers, sisters with the same scenario. And, they just can't afford it. And they end up, 2 or 3 siblings trying to figure out how to pay for it. So it's a big struggle, but we've got to find a way to work closer with people that have these challenges and do whatever we can to make a difference in their support. And one time I heard that the last 6 months of someone's life, you spend 50% in terms of what healthcare you might spend in a lifetime. So it's a big thing we want to try to get our arms around quickly.
Congressman Tonko, when it comes to shortening this time frame for CMS to cover important drugs, important tests, what are your thoughts on other ways that we can shorten that timeline? Obviously, your ASAP Act is one way, but this is happening to other drugs, to other treatments.
Fundamentally, research. I'm such a believer in science and evidence-based policy development. We need to commit to research. I'm thankful that Congress denied the cuts that President Trump wanted to make to research. I see what happened to some of the small business research firms in my district. They were making great strides with macular degeneration and Parkinson's, to name a few. And they were concerned that if they got that funding cut, which was primarily federal funding, they would be shutting down. And you just can't shut off and turn it back on with research. It delays significantly. So research, absolutely. And then staffing levels. I heard Mr. Rogan talk about the staffing cuts at CMS, at NIH, at CDC. These are huge cuts, 18 to 20% in some cases, tens of thousands of people cut from the healthcare service system of the federal government. That is not the kind of progressive approach that we need in response to healthcare. And healthcare in general has been impacted so severely with the Big Beautiful Bill. So, we have a lot of investment to return to research, which will help us along. And that, genomic discovery can assist in many areas of diseases that deal with the brain and the nervous system.
Congressman Buchanan, I know this is, you said, very personal to you. Were you concerned? I saw a report this week about how NIH Alzheimer's grants were cut 52%. There were 369 of them funded in 2024, and in 2025 there were 177. And I'm hearing researchers say that they're concerned, well, yes, the best funded grants that will pursue more mainstream theories will get funded, but it's the creative, the small, the breakthrough ideas that won't be. And that's what we need now for Alzheimer's.
Yeah, we have to take a look at the whole thing. I was looking at the numbers today. 580,000 people have Alzheimer's in Florida alone. I'm in Florida, 3.7 billion in terms of Medicaid. So all these people that are investing time and energy in terms of moving forward, we've got to get behind them and support them in every way we can. I know that's my attitude, and Paul and I think, share the same mindset in terms of making a difference going forward.
Kathleen, I would also add that beyond, denying the progress that research can make when you cut those grants, it's demoralizing to the researcher community. They'll move on to some other project or find another avenue within their science career. And I think it's going to deflate the efforts to really move forward aggressively, which this whole sequence of bills has been about. Prime focus on Alzheimer's, research, better diagnosis, working with the primary care docs with the BOLD Act to enable them to have better knowledge on diagnosis and treatment and referral, patient care, the respite care that is provided. All of this is a package of goods. The ADAPT program, which is certainly reaching to the primary care community to connect them so that there's this holistic approach from the different disciplines of medical doctors.
Yeah, let me just add also, we're spending $5 trillion a year. When you look at in terms of totality, And you can make the argument that we're getting sicker as a society. That's the numbers in terms around the globe. You look at various countries, they spend a lot less and seem to get a lot more. We've got to find a way to look at all of this and make sure the things that really matter can make the difference in a huge way. And I think that a lot of that starts with prevention. We react to what someone has as a scenario, then we try to deal with it. We've got to be more proactive on the front end and deal with it. And that's why I'm so excited about the bill that we've got together. We need to find a way to get that done.
How do we really get that message to resonate and for Americans to really absorb that when it comes to prevention and lifestyle? Help people understand, you may not have to take these medicines, receive these therapies if you exercised, if you ate right. That lifestyle is so critical.
I think the big thing I try to emphasize is that you need to be, in today's world, CEO of your own health. Someone wrote a book. I like that idea, but we've got to take more responsibility. I've got 10 grandkids, 10 and under, and I watch my one daughter-in-law. She has 7, and you go in there and they got fruits and vegetables, and they're much more. I'm so excited about. There's much more focus on it, and then. I'll sneak a Diet Coke or something in the back, and my grandkids will come up. They're like 7, 8, and they say, "Papa, that's poison. You can't drink that." So I go, "Oh my God!" But that is a reality. Again, 10 grandkids, and that I'm fighting, for their future as well, in terms of what we're trying to do here today. But I think it all starts with prevention. I don't like the idea. My mother passed away from colon cancer, but by the time she found out about it, it was too late. And you've got to do the annual things. I just tell people, even if it just means as little as getting a physical every January, that's what I've always tried to do. And then you get a couple of tweaks, you can adjust that, make the adjustment. And I think people really have to take their own, because I just see the amount of money that was being spent out there across the board. And it's scary how much money we're spending. There's a lot of money. We've got to redirect and figure a way to deal with it where we can make the difference in people that have small businesses trying to make a difference on what we were talking about earlier.
Well, Kathleen, I would say, too, the tone can be established at the top by the federal government, and encouraging people through public information, public education, and just messaging. But when you start cutting wellness programs and nutrition programs, it's a mixed message. It's a hypocrisy of sorts. So we really need to advance that whole effort towards preventative aspects of healthcare delivery.
I think it's interesting. I think they have found that, sadly, it is the less healthy foods and the sodas and things that are more affordable for so many families in our country. And when you don't have the money to eat healthfully, then you do what you can to feed your family. That's heartbreaking.
And there's great disparity.
You've got to eat, in my mind, real food, and that's part of the problem. A lot of our food's highly processed. Nobody's problem, but most of the food that we eat is junk. And, so we have to find a way to, again, people to be motivated to educate themselves and their children to make better choices. I know in my case, one book I read that made a big difference for me, because when you're in your 40s, your weight goes up and down all the time. But he had a formula, and in the formula, at the top of it was the nutritional value of the food you're about ready to consume. And below that, the equation, it was calories. So the essence of what's the most nutritional food, fewest calories. And he went out and looked at all the foods that are out there and wrote a book and put it together. So you can make better choices when you go to the buffet thing or whatever. And I say, because of my weight, I never had to pay attention again about my weight per se, because I was making better choices. And then I tell everybody, my grandkids and everybody, it needs to be 80-20. I'm not, like 80% of the time make good choices, but you got to know what those choices are, and a lot of them are disguised. And I think the money that we invest in terms of, we make a lot of investments with our children, school programs, we've got to make sure they get good nutritional food. And that's kind of where I come from with all this stuff. I see it all the time where lobbyists will come in, or different people will come in, and they're selling this, that, or whatever, but it just doesn't work.
I'm curious if either of you share the concern that my first guest did, that because there is no 100% cure for Alzheimer's, that's behind this resistance to pay for these preventive tests?
Well, I think one of the things that we did, I've done so much work with the Alzheimer's community and a number of their bills that I've been lead sponsor on or lead Democrat. One of those was making certain that the budgeting for the Alzheimer's response from federal government be done by science input, clinicians telling us what that level ought to be. And, for such a huge impact that Alzheimer's has, population count and the devastation that comes with the disease, I think it's so critical to have that science-based response to what the budget numbers ought to look like. And so you take that with all the other improvements that we've been advancing since the Project Act, really has, I think, made a better outcome. But it's about funding. We have to move forward and make certain we don't roll back all of the commitments that we need to make on behalf of the elements, the building blocks that are part of that chain of progress.
I'm bullish. I think we're gonna move along hopefully quicker than we have. And we just need to galvanize and have a vision for where we're at, but more importantly, where we're going, and then try to bring the resources together for that. And I think this starts with our bill. It'll make a big difference, but there's a lot more that we can do. But I just think in healthcare in general, or in health, I should say, we're not necessarily in the healthy business. I mean, it's unfortunate with the way, healthcare is across the country, but I think a lot of people are just getting bad advice in terms of what's nutritional and what's not. And that's why they get back to the idea of eating real food.
But again, just curious about his concern that it's sort of like with HIV, with hepatitis C, the folks are saying, if you don't have a cure, then why are we spending money on these tests?
Well, it takes time somewhat to get a cure, but I like to think, Paul and I and others, there's a lot of momentum right now, more than I've ever seen, especially in terms of the subject that we're talking about today. And it's bipartisan. Of the 50 members that are co-sponsors, it's bipartisan, and in the Senate. So we've got some good momentum. I think everybody's touched. They either know a family member or somebody in their community or a friend that's had Alzheimer's, and it just makes sense that we find a way to come together. But it needs to be accelerated. And I think there's been a lot of great effort, but we need to go on a quicker way going forward to get, try to get some of these, what we can try to prevent more. And I think there's some opportunities out there. We got to see if they make sense going forward.
Now, I know you've both been very active in this space. You've both received humanitarian awards from the Alzheimer's Association. How important do you think it is, not only for current patients, but for future generations, your grandkids and mine, that we get our hand on this disease that is taking such a toll?
Yeah, especially if you've got a parent or a brother or someone that's got the disease, you've got a higher probability. And, so we need to do whatever we can, I think, as quickly as we can, and get something done. I'm optimistic. I think we've got a lot of good people that are very motivated and very focused. But I do think we have to have a clear plan and exactly where we're at and where we're going. And then let us, Paul and us and others that can, plug into that and make a difference in our communities.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest commodities we can offer as a government is hope. And the hope that comes by bringing these groups together. You mentioned the Alzheimer's Association, their annual gathering, the March on the Hill. You see the Purple Brigade going through the halls of government. That's an impact. The people still rule, I believe. The public sentiment, if you have it, it's what's going to build success. Without it, it's tough to achieve. But I think there's public sentiment here, and there's a therapeutic element to it for people traveling similar journeys to come together and speak collectively. Yeah, your individual voice matters, but that collective voice, too, is important. And I would suggest to everyone here, if you believe in Vern's bill and mine, the Alzheimer's Screening and Prevention Act, ASAP, please call your colleagues in the House and in the Senate ASAP.
Yeah.
What do you think your chances are of passage before you retire? Because unfortunately,
I'm working on that very
We're going to get it
aggressively.
done, right? It's a gift I have to give Vern.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm very excited about it. We're going to get it done. I mean, that's my mindset. We'll get it done. But I do want to go back to one thing. I mean, there's different things, but one of the things there are things we can do to maybe slow things down or whatever: diet, exercise, social ability, all the things that are written in, if you go online, you see that. I think that's critical as well in terms of this effort, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of people, and I'm guilty of it, you stop at fast food and you eat, that's your diet. The other day, someone said the problem in America is nobody cooks anymore at home. They don't even have utensils to cook. And so when you go and eat something at a restaurant, God only knows what you're eating.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on the implications if your bill doesn't pass soon, if action doesn't happen on these blood biomarker tests that are so critical, because Alzheimer's cases are expected to double to nearly 14 million. Mm-hmm. And that's by 2050. Right now, 20% of Medicare spending is spent on Alzheimer's. By that point, they're saying it will be 1 in 3 Medicare dollars.
Right.
So
it's that rationale, Kathleen, that Vernon and I use with our colleagues. We can bankrupt the system or respond with dignity and compassion. And, I think a budget is a statement of our priorities. And I would just question people like that I serve with. Why is conquering Alzheimer's not a high priority? We found ways to spend money on things that I think are counterproductive or draining our budget, that draw money from us billions a day. We could apply that to Alzheimer's rather than some of these other choices that have been made of late.
And I've seen it because I've been on the health committee quite a while, where we were spending $600 billion in Medicare. Today we're spending $1.2 trillion, and that's just on that. And then on the Medicaid stuffs and other, started out $100 billion, $200 billion. Now all of a sudden we're at $700, $800, $900 billion. That's $2 trillion between the two programs, and it's quickly going to another level. So we have to find a way to do more with less.
that's the hope.
Or do the right thing with what we have, right?
I like both of those.
Yeah.
Congressman Tonko, Congressman Buchanan, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. So if you would now, we are moving to our last panel, and we're going to be talking about balancing Alzheimer's, innovation, and early detection tools. So join me in welcoming Dr. Kara Leahy, Director of Cognitive Disorders at Memorial Healthcare and a Doctor of Neurology at the Memorial Healthcare Institute. John Dwyer, President of the Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation, and Carol Roan Grayson's Dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. So welcome all. So Kara, John, Carol, I know that you each represent very key aspects of the Alzheimer's universe, from diagnosis to speedy development of therapies to hands-on care and treatment. How are the blood-based biomarker tests impacting your work right now?
So I've been using blood-based biomarkers to help diagnose Alzheimer's for the last 2.5 years. And I wanted to try them because at the time we had very little access to the other diagnostic tests for Alzheimer's, which are PET scans and at that time spinal fluid testing. I work in Michigan, and it's in the middle of the state, which I have a lot of rural community members that are my patients, and also patients that come from the capital area. And what I was seeing is that it was just taking so long for patients to come and see me. And there are a lot of reasons why for that. But when I first ask a patient how long they've been noticing memory problems or how long their family members have been, the average answer is about 2 to 3 years in my community.
And they're only then at the 2 to 3 year point seeking help?
Well, sometimes they've been seeking help for a while, but they haven't been able to get answers. They haven't been able to get a clear diagnosis, which was historically very difficult. As we heard from Jay, the patient, he had 2 cognitive tests completed before any of the diagnostic tests that really test the biology of Alzheimer's. So sometimes it has been taking a long time to get a diagnosis. But the blood tests on the same appointment, the first appointment now, when I'm talking to someone and I'm ordering other labs to look for causes of memory impairment, I also order a blood test. And within a week and a half, we know if we're heading toward a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or we're looking in other directions. So it speeds up that incredibly so since we've started to use that. And I've had patients who have gone to multiple neurologists or clinics, and at the time of getting the results back of these blood tests, are very emotional because they finally have a piece of paper that they can hold with something that is objectively telling them that their loved one has Alzheimer's. And the answer is important to people, not just about the treatments. It's the answer of why.
Right. They have some certainty.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
John?
Yes.
How is it impacting your work, these tests?
The blood tests have changed the whole landscape of both allowing people to understand their condition and to take a more progressive, proactive approach towards their condition. Not everyone has a physician available to them like you. Mm-hmm. In fact, the blood tests are the great democratic method for allowing people to understand their cognitive condition and the underlying pathologies for their condition. You can't get PET scans in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho.
You're kidding.
To detect this disease because the ligand isn't available. And then by geography, there's big parts of other states that are not able to even get PET. So blood tests are not just significant, but they're a watershed change. Primary care is the first line of defense in Alzheimer's disease. Mm-hmm. People come to their family physician, their internal medicine, their primary care doc, and just recently the FDA cleared a test, which, and I'll finish on this point, Kathleen. They just cleared a test which is so unique in my 40 years of being in healthcare, because in the label, it calls it out as for the use of primary care physicians to determine the presence of amyloidosis in people with signs and symptoms of dementia. Primary care don't get many blood tests that call them out specifically. This test allows you to say, if you get a negative result on that test, it's a 90% negative predictive value, and you're going to be able to say, you got something, but you don't have Alzheimer's. And then they can go to her, and she now knows what the underlying condition is. Or they go figure out their lifestyle, diet, do they have a bladder infection? That's a game changer, and now we've got all kinds of underserved communities that can start to appreciate their condition.
Carol, now I know your work's a little different. Are these blood tests impacting you and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm an economist, and one of the things that we have been studying is thinking about digital markers of Alzheimer's disease that could be helpful in early detection. My own work has been around looking at how people's personal finances change prior to a diagnosis. Oftentimes, symptoms start many years prior to diagnosis, and that impacts people's financial decisions and their financial habits. And so one of the things we've been trying to explore is a slightly different early marker for Alzheimer's, which is, can we use information on these changes in personal finances to think about identifying people who would be prioritized for additional clinical screening? And I think what our research really speaks to is the value of that early detection, whether it's blood biomarker or something else, because many people experience enormous personal financial consequences prior to diagnosis. Many people have their credit scores decline, they have more payment delinquencies, and if we can avert some of those financial losses, that speaks to a key value of early detection.
Kara, I know you were talking about that delay that you see among some patients when they come to you. And then we've heard today how much less expensive these blood-based biomarker tests are than a PET scan or than a lumbar puncture. But how difficult is coverage even for the tests as you're using them? Because I understand, I mean, you're based in Michigan, correct?
Yes.
And even the cost of those tests is unaffordable for some of your patients, and that's the same in many rural areas of the country.
I've ordered over 400 blood biomarker tests. Each time I order them currently, because they are not covered by the insurance plans in our area, most of my patients have Medicare Advantage plans or commercial insurance, which do not cover any of the blood biomarkers. So each time I have ordered them, I have helped in the room at the first appointment, help the patients fill out a financial assistance form. The lab company that we use is very generous in having a financial assistance, which has allowed those patients to get these blood tests. For people in my area, they have the lowest income, and they pay $50 or $100 for these tests. Sometimes that's too much, and we're not able to do that. So, and I think that, it's particularly difficult for patients in rural communities to even discuss with their doctor their finances. And I wish they didn't have to do that with me. But I know that is the only way that I can get these tests to be affordable for them right now. And it's a big deal, and it's very helpful to have these. We need better coverage for this with the Medicare Advantage plans and commercial insurers. There is no way to have them covered in my area currently. And this is just for diagnostic. This isn't talking about the preventative use of them that we want to see coming in the ASAP Act, but just currently in a diagnostic test. These tests are prime time. They are good. They are accurate. They are as good as any test we've ever had for Alzheimer's. They are much cheaper than the amyloid PET scan that is currently reimbursed by Medicare. And we need to look to see where we can save money and where we need to expand that access. Blood biomarkers are here, and we need to start making them accessible to everyone. Insurance is the biggest barrier.
It sounds almost counterintuitive, though, because if the person doesn't get the test, then their disease is more likely to worsen, resulting in more costs to the insurance company in the long run.
Yeah, I think sometimes, when I get a blood test and it's positive, that's the end, right? We have an answer. We're talking about treatments. If I'm not able to get that blood test, we go to the next thing, which is an amyloid PET scan, $10,000 versus a few $100s. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to my patients either in the room, I can tell you that. Really common comment that a patient will say after I talk about the blood tests and are they interested in them, they say, well, I have good insurance, so it's probably covered. And I think that really speaks to how people assume that something as simple as a blood test for a terminal illness would be covered under good insurance. This is just common sense to the people in my area.
John, you spoke very highly of these blood-based biomarker tests, how important they are, the impact they're having. But I have heard some criticize them just on one note, that they were not tested on a diverse enough population. Now, be that as it may, I know that that's really a focus of your trials at GAP, that it's
right.
Making sure that whatever drug, whatever therapy you're testing is tested on people of all ethnicities. Talk about how critical that is.
Well, first of all, it's essential that you have both therapies and diagnostics that work for everybody. It's counterintuitive to have any other condition. Happily, I can say with high confidence, if you look at the label on the Fuji-Ray Bio clearance, they used the data from one of our studies in addition to a couple others. And in our study, over about 24% of the participants in that study were either African American, Latino, or Asian American, which just about represents the distribution of AD patients. A little low, but it's by far and away the most that the field has ever seen. The FDA took that into gave that great weight, took that into account, said, and part of the clearance was based on the fact that they had demonstrated that it performed equivalency across that whole group. If we aren't, the incidence and prevalence of dementia, not necessarily Alzheimer's disease, in medical deserts, in underrepresented populations, is very high, and for multiple reasons. And as a consequence, we need these blood tests to be available there, and we also need to encourage their use because it's not all Alzheimer's, folks. And to be more precise about how we're going to treat people, we have got to be able to get a better handle on what the underlying pathologies and conditions are.
Carol, I wondered if you could do a little deeper dive into your research, because I do think it is so fascinating. And I thought Jay's story in that opening video, he went and bought, what was it, a BMW or something? I mean, just going and buying a luxury car that he couldn't afford on a whim like that. Talk about how that kind of act is common and how what you're learning could actually become a sort of a test to, or a red flag that, hey, you need to get this further testing, potentially for Alzheimer's or another type of dementia.
Yeah, so we've been doing this work for over 10 years now, and I've talked to many people along the way. And when I talk with them, I hear stories of parents who have oversubscribed to magazine subscriptions, gotten their driveway paved too many times, changed their shopping habits and bought the same pair of jeans over and over, had unpaid parking tickets. And what our research tried to do was to say, can we take these anecdotes and find systematic evidence that, in fact, personal finances and financial decisions are changing prior to diagnosis? Early symptoms, cognitive, neuropsychiatric symptoms like agitation, and personality changes like extroversion and conscientiousness, all those things can change well before a diagnosis. And all of those things have been linked to how people make financial decisions. So there's this risk period prior to diagnosis when family members might be aware that things are happening and they can step in and provide oversight. So what we did was we linked together Medicare data and data from Equifax, which is a credit agency, in partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And then we looked backwards from the date of diagnosis of Alzheimer's to say, can we see evidence of poor financial outcomes prior to diagnosis? We know from research that once you get diagnosed, the caregiving costs are enormous. And what we show is that 6.5 years prior to a diagnosis, we can see a decline in credit score. We can see increases in payment delinquency. We can see people having a higher probability of maxing out their credit cards. And those things can create an enormous financial burden. You can have interest rates that are higher, limited access to credit if your credit scores go down. Payment delinquency can mean you have these increased costs. All that's happening as a runway just to the time when people need resources to be able to pay for care. And so those changes are something that we want to highlight to people. It's not that everyone who pays a bill necessarily forgets to pay a bill has Alzheimer's. But if that is seen in a family member, that can be a signal to people that maybe mom or dad needs to talk with a trusted family member, a trusted friend, and put in some of these guardrails. And it represents, compared to something like screening for cancer where you have a treatment and there are more limited treatments for Alzheimer's, but it represents a value of early diagnosis, being able to not have those financial vulnerabilities occur.
Now, I could see that also being a really interesting entree to what's a difficult discussion, right? How do you approach your 75, 80-year-old mother, father, and say, could I look at your, bank statements or your credit card bills? I mean, how do you do that? But if you pull this article or send them a link, if they're, tech savvy, you can say, hey, isn't this interesting? Yeah, let's talk about this.
Yeah, an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. Having those systems in place before those financial consequences happen. There's advice about, for example, a trusted contact on a bank account or a credit union account, where if there's unusual activity, and it could be financial exploitation or a person's own changes in judgment, that person can be contacted by the bank to say, hey, did you want to have this $10,000 withdrawal? This seems very unusual, for example. So the idea of a trusted contact and just to start a conversation within a family about understanding maybe mom or dad's or a friend's finances is really important.
Let's talk about education, because this use of these blood-based biomarker tests that is currently not covered by Medicare and that the ASAP Act would change is it being given to someone who has no symptoms? So let's talk about education and how do we make sure, if and when that happens, that the tests are not misused, so we don't have false positives and then people seeking expensive treatments that they don't need?
Yeah, I mean, the tests that we have now have been FDA cleared for diagnostics and for rule out in primary care. We are testing them right now in a predictive, preventative sort of way, and we're coming up with better and better results in that way. But currently, right now, although the daughter or son oftentimes in an appointment will say, hey, can I get that blood test, right, if mom's getting it? And I have to say that if you're not having any symptoms, we can't use these tests yet. But we're working toward that. And I say that that's the party in Alzheimer's right now. And the research and clinical community is looking at being able to screen for Alzheimer's disease in primary care and start treatment before people have symptoms. And that is what is a really exciting topic that we're hoping the research shows that we're able to use some of these currently available treatments in that kind of setting. I mean, the focus of that research is to help people that are currently in their 30s, 40s, and maybe 50s. So that is us, right? So what we're looking for with this ASAP Act is not necessarily to help my patients today. It's to help their kids or their grandkids. And that's also very hopeful even to my patients.
John, are you familiar with these trials that are underway right now that are testing the blood-based biomarker tests on very young people with no symptoms?
Yes, so that's what we do. We do clinical trials for both therapeutic and biomarkers and digital cognitive tests that might align with your economic research. I did want to start by saying something about just brain health generally. It's been a lot of really important work. We've been very active in that area since 2018. And you can talk about exercise, you can talk about diet, but we understate the importance of getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And not smoking. Just do those two things, and you knock down your risk by about 15%. And those are not heavy lifts if you just think about your lifestyle a little bit more. The rest of it, really important. I'm not running a 4-minute mile anytime soon, but I think that the ability to set a predicate for the field in general and for patients in general to control their health is really important. Now, the tests we're doing, the technology is exploding. I don't think the field has ever seen the number of blood tests in neurology and the number of methods for measuring the presence of different pathologies the way we're testing them now. And soon we're going to be able to go to our doctor and not just get blood tests for Alzheimer's disease, but for Parkinson's, for ALS, and for MS. And then they have these things when my colleague here doesn't know exactly, they call them syndromes rather than disease. And it's fine because it's fair. But we're going to be able to start isolating quite precisely where the unknowns are and then targeting them for better care planning and, candidly, better therapies. All that's within 2 years, we're going to have 5 different disease states that we can test for, maybe 3 years, that we only have 1 for today, maybe 2. And even cancer didn't see that kind of geometric pop. So there's a lot going on, Kathleen. The testing looks good. How soon early we're going to test is an open question. Right now, the FDA is very focused on signs and symptoms being present before you can use these tests. That's not irresponsible because we need a track record. But we're going to help the whole country with these tests, not just isolated pockets where there's great tertiary hospitals.
Carol, what are your thoughts on the importance of education of patients, of physicians, of families when it comes to any of these early tests for Alzheimer's?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to think about the ethical implications of these tests, and I'll offer kind of 2 buckets of considerations. Anytime we think about a test like this, an early diagnostic test, we have to think about the value and then the risks and potential harms. And in the case of Alzheimer's, where we don't have a lot of treatment, unlike something like cancer, we could start early treatment, we can think about the great psychological harm that you might feel if you're diagnosed with a disease and as terrible as Alzheimer's is. So as we think about implementation, we have to think about how we can mitigate that kind of risk. What counseling will be available to people if there is a good and accurate test? And then the second piece is that there's always the possibility that this kind of testing information could be used in a socially detrimental way with respect to employment or getting insurance or getting a driver's license. So we also need to ensure, as we think about moving to population screening, that we have in place a legal and regulatory framework that protects people against those kinds of risks. So those are two really important considerations.
So a lot of privacy concerns, you're saying.
A lot of privacy concerns. And then I would say that the other kind of big piece is implementation and how we involve the stakeholder community in implementation. And there I think the principles of autonomy and informed consent are really important. And by autonomy, I mean, can people choose, opt in or opt out? If they don't want to know, right, if that would be causing them too much psychological harm, that they can make a choice if they want to have this screening test. And that they are presented with information about the accuracy of the test so they know the potential for false negatives and false positives. So really thinking carefully about how do we involve stakeholders in ensuring both autonomy and informed consent, availability of counseling in a way that supports the community as we roll this kind of thing out.
You know, in recent years, we've really seen, I guess the last 5 years or so, these incredible breakthroughs, right, in Alzheimer's disease. And I'm curious what you attribute that to, and are you optimistic that this will continue?
Maybe 5-6 years ago, we didn't use the word hope in Alzheimer's. We were careful about that. We didn't want to be in the market of false hope. There's a lot out there. It's a big business. So we didn't really use that. We were hopeful that something in the future would come. I use that word all the time now. We use it in Alzheimer's because there is hope. There is hope that we are making these strides, not just for diagnosis, but for treatments too. And I get to see that every single day with my patients. I have patients that are stable on the new treatments for coming up now on about 3 years. They haven't changed. That's incredibly hopeful. I have people talking about that they're proud to be on new treatments and have these new blood tests because they want to be part of this generation that paves the way so that their grandkids can have a different future, that they don't fear this disease. All of these things are incredibly hopeful. And that has a big impact on the patients and in my staff, in my clinic, that we can work through some of these issues that do become, that are hurdles and concerns with insurance issues. And what propels us forward is this hope. And I think that seeing all of you guys here today when I walked in was incredibly hopeful for me as well, as I'm just in a little room, talking to people through their illnesses, to think that you guys are all here in Washington and that you're pushing and helping to pave the path for things to be easier in that room with that patient. So thank you for that.
John, hopeful?
Oh, yeah. 7 years ago, we've been in business 10 years. As recently as 7 years ago, the leading neurologist, present company accepted, were saying, I diagnose and then say adios because I have nothing I can do for them. That's a very, very chilling clinical experience. Now, by the way, I acknowledge and agree that we have to have a very clear point of view of how we're going to consult with patients, how we're going to consult with families. These have to be informed conversations between their doctors and their physicians. We do clinical trials. We see a lot of people, around 50 years old, who come to us to get evaluated for a clinical trial because they don't want it in their electronic medical record. They don't want to even tell their doctor that they are worried about their cognitive condition, and we give them a safe harbor for them to start to get a handle on where their situation is. So there's some
That's because they have privacy concerns?
They have big-time privacy concerns. The biggest privacy concern is I'm a vice president of real estate for a hotel chain, and now I'm a little worried about my memory. I don't want that showing up in my medical record, even though that's supposed to be private from my employer, because stuff gets around. So these are real issues, but information is power. This bill is critically important to creating a ubiquitous understanding of where the actual disease is and related diseases. We need to get testing done so that we know exactly what we're dealing with and how we can develop other therapies to attack other pathologies that are present in this disease. So I applaud what Tonko and the congressman were doing. Also, my buddy Mark Warner in the Senate, their leadership's critical. If we can get this done this year, everybody in this room is better off.
And Carol, what do you think? I mean, despite the fact that we saw NIH Alzheimer's research grants cut by 52% from 2024 to 2025, are you hopeful that the progress we've made will continue?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Representative Tonko's point about NIH funding. My own research over the last 10 years has been funded by the National Institute on Aging, and that has allowed us to develop the kinds of data that have helped us identify these financial indicators and that are helping us think about whether we can use those in a way that can really help Alzheimer's patients. And so being able to continue to fund researchers, even when it's, when I first started talking about this idea, it was a little out of the box and people thought, yeah, this seems a little out there. But to think about innovative research that we can bring to bear and that we invest in researchers in this space is important. So I think, I'm hopeful as long as we continue to be able to invest in research for our Alzheimer's community.
Well, Carol, John, Kara, wow. What insights, just so wonderful. And that brings us to the end of our program. I want to thank everyone here in the room and everyone watching us online on the live stream. And thank you most of all to our sponsor, Alliance for Aging Research. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for your generosity. And this is, again, such a critical issue. To the point you made, Kara, I hope we brought some hope to a lot of people in the room and to people watching. And if anyone missed this event, a friend you think should watch it, it will be available, the full video on thehill.com. So thank you all and have a wonderful day.